Welcome to all of you. Good morning. I'm Gavin Kelly, the Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation. Thanks to everyone in the room for joining us, and thanks to the large numbers that I know are joining us online. If football is your thing, then I hope you relished last night and that you've managed to calm down. If football's not your thing, then I'm hoping you have a safe space here for the next hour or so. Enjoy it. It's the only one you're going to have until at least Monday, I would say, because well, who knows? There may be a few football analogies, but we won't be talking about that. We will, however, be talking about a week on from the election results, kind of what to make of where we stand. I think now people have had a bit of space to digest what happened last week, but also to see the makeup of the new government, to hear its first words. So it's a good moment to sort of assess the outlook for that new Labour government and the challenges it faces, and to kick around how it might go about its work. I think I would just say there's been a kind of interesting and slightly curious ambivalence in much of the commentary about the kind of moment we are in. The result was rightly, and obviously in many ways, described as an emphatic victory. It's a very, very large majority by any historical standards. Yet some have sort of suggested it wasn't really that much of a victory at all. Equally, it's been said that by many people that this is the worst inheritance of any government ever since World War II. At the same time as other observers have argued that actually, if you look at it carefully, it might actually be quite a good election to have won, because they sense there's a kind of upswing in the breeze, so to speak. And I also think it's kind of a kind of interesting time, because I don't feel like we had much purchase on the kind of core ideological character of this government yet. There's some people think it's kind of New Labour too, some people think it's not that at all. It's more kind of going to be a sort of 21st century of a kind of Wilsonian project of national economic development. Other people think, possibly quite rightly, that all these comparisons are a bit tired and we should move on. But I don't feel like we've got a really good handle on that, and indeed how it's going to go about kind of reconciling and resolving some of the really big economic, fiscal and political challenges that this country faces. So these are just some of the issues that I hope we are going to be grappling with over the next hour. And to help us through this, we have a fantastic panel. I'm really delighted we've got this group together. I'll just very briefly say, you will probably know all of them if you're in this room, but Heather Stewart, to my immediate left, is special correspondent at The Guardian, which is a marvellous job title. I'd like that one day. And has been the political editor of The Guardian and the economics editor of The Observer and all sorts of things. Sam Fleming, to Heather's left, is the economics editor at the FT. And then Nick Pearce is professor at Bath University and was the last head of the number 10 policy unit under the last Labour government. And then we have Paula Surridge, who is Professor of Political Sociology at Bristol University and also Deputy Director at UK a-changin Europe. So we're in good hands, and I'm looking forward to what all of our speakers have to say. We're going to make sure we have time to hear from the audience. So if you're online, please do ask your questions on slido.com. You can do it too. If you're in the room, we have a mic. We'll make sure we have some time to hear from you. But before we turn to our panel, I'm going to kick off with, as briefly as I can, just by saying a few words about the kind of context for this discussion. Basically, what has the new government inherited, and what are just a few of the challenges it faces. After all, it wouldn't be a Resolution Foundation event if there wasn't at least a few charts. I'm hoping they're going to work. They do. Now, if you're in this room, you probably know already that it has been an extraordinary era over the last 15 and 17 years or so in terms of stagnating productivity, which has resulted in flatlining pay, which really is the central challenge of our times. Now, lots of countries have experienced this since the financial crisis. We are hardly alone. We are unusual for the scale of the productivity and pay stagnation we have experienced. And that means we have fallen further behind a number of other peer countries in terms of pay. So it's not just that there was a big thing called the financial crisis and that it affected everyone equally. It didn't. That has translated, not surprisingly, into flatlining living standards. This chart shows you basically what's happened in every parliament over the last century and more. What you will see if you look to the far right is that the last parliament that we've just lived through is the first parliament in at least 70 years where living standards actually, they flatlined. They marginally fell, but basically they were completely flat. Last time that happened for the Keen was the Attlee government of 50 to 51, which wasn't a real parliament, it was just 1 year. You have to go back to Lloyd George after World War I to get the last time that people ended up materially poorer at the end of a parliament than they did at the start, and that was during the Spanish flu. It is not surprising that we have a fractious, disappointed, unhappy electorate, given that. Now, if you're in an era of slow growth, if you're in an era of an ageing population, and if you're living through higher interest rates, you are almost by definition in an era of fiscal pressure, and likely to be in an era of higher taxes. Now, as we all know, the current government, the new government, has committed to the existing debt rule, the debt rule that was in place under the last government, which in many ways isn't actually, in normal times, a particularly onerous debt rules in some respects, but it is going to seriously chafe throughout this parliament. For all the reasons we all know in terms of the condition of public services, the pressures on public sector pay, and the massive needs in terms of public investment. This is going to be an ongoing thing living within that debt rule. And I'm sure we'll return to that in our conversation. Now, of course, it may be the case that good economic news turns up, and indeed, an hour or two ago, there was a bit of good economic news in terms of the GDP figures. Things change, right? So none of this is locked in, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty about everything, and that hangs over everything I'm going to say or everything anyone else is going to say. So things might get better, but I wouldn't be banking on it. I say that for two reasons in the kind of fiscal space. One is because the condition of our public services is so dire that I think a lot of the debate about, well, could they live with just, a little bit less next year and the year after, is kind of missing the point about the real underlying pressures that those public services face if they're going to sort of get onto a more positive kind of period of improvement. So I think there just are huge pressures there that I'm not sure we've properly reckoned with. Secondly, the current forecasts from the OBR have within them upbeat assumptions about productivity growth. They are at the kind of cheerier end of the spectrum. They are running ahead, those assumptions, of reality in terms of the productivity data. So either that productivity data is going to have to improve, or those assumptions are going to have to be downgraded. One or other of those things is going to have to happen. And what this chart shows you with the purple line, if you can see, I think it's kind of mauve line shows you, is that it would only, if we shave 0.2% of the OBR central productivity assumption, then that leads to a deterioration in the fiscal outlook of about 17 billion roughly a year, and that's enough on its own to mean that the debt rule won't be met. So there is no room for manoeuvre, if you like, in terms of a downgrade. And I'm not saying there will be a downgrade, but I'm just sort of saying it wouldn't take much to knock the whole debate in a direction which would be very unhelpful for a new Chancellor. So that's the fiscal rules. What does that mean for public spending? So if you take the kind of current growth outlook, if you take, and you're going to meet the kind of debt rule as I've been talking about, then that does imply significant cuts to some, not all, to some public services, the public services departments which are unprotected. And these numbers, you can get slightly different numbers depending on exactly how you do it, but we think basically roughly 18 billion of cuts for unprotected departments is probably in the right sort of ballpark to meet these current, given the current numbers, given the current outlook, and those cuts would fall on things like prisons, councils, courts. And you have to ask, do you think that's plausible? And I mean that sort of seriously, like do we really think that's plausible? I'm sceptical whether that scale of cuts is actually plausible. I'm not predicting that will happen, I'm just saying that's what the arithmetic looks like today. My guess is it won't happen, at least at that scale, but that's going to lead to pressure somewhere else. And if we don't, oh goodness me, that was something just leapt. Oh dear. Can we, there we go. Thank you, that was done by magic. And if growth doesn't pick up, then we are going to feel more pressure on taxes. And the point of this chart is just to remind you of the pressure that's already there, the tax rises that are already baked in based on the decisions the last government made. So this has nothing to do with any new tax rises. And it shows you an upward trajectory of the tax share. We have fiscal drag in terms of income tax thresholds baked in for 3 full years after the year we're in. And just to give you a sense of what that means, we used to have, I think it was, we had 6% of adults were in the higher rate or additional rate tax band in 2010. That went up to 15% by around now. So that went up to 13% now, and it's going to go up to 15% by 2028 as things stand. And that's without any new tax announcement. So there's a lot of tax politics to come in any world in the Parliament ahead, and that's before there's any debate about whether there needs to be further tax rises. So that is a challenging fiscal backdrop to a discussion about future priorities. I'm just now going to touch very, very briefly on a few different priorities which are going to be sitting on ministers' desks right now. One of these is that, as we've talked about actually events in this room recently. We are an older, sicker country with much higher levels of prevalence of disability than we used to, and that is a massive social challenge for our country in all manner of ways. And we need to sort of think about it in a broad sense, but it does have a near-term fiscal consequence in that we are expecting, and these are OBR numbers, spending on health-related and disability benefits to rise by about 20 billion by 2028-29. That's very roughly the equivalent to about 3p on the basic rate of income tax. That is a major challenge, and that is very, very hard to change that quickly. There's deep demographic and other reasons driving that. So that is a serious challenge for any government, and you can't be remotely glib just saying, oh, we'll kind of tweak this benefit and that will go away. It won't. At the same time, the government has big ambitions, rightly, for the housing market as a massive issue of sort of social pressure in this country. And without getting into the details, the government has said itself that it wants to build 1.5 million new homes over the Parliament. That is an ambitious number, right? I mean, governments have set targets before, but that is a very ambitious number. And if you're serious about that, just to put that in context, that has never happened in my lifetime. No government has actually achieved 300,000. The last time that was actually achieved was 1969. I'm not saying remotely it can't be done, but I'm just giving that as a step change. It's basically a near doubling in annual completion rates in housing. And of course, at the same time as this is all going on, this is the kind of the late 2020s is the kind of the era where the net zero investment requirements really ramp up, particularly in transport infrastructure, buildings, heating systems, and of course just our basic energy infrastructure as we move towards electrification. A lot of that is private investment. The bulk of that, the clear bulk of that, is private investment, clearly. But a lot of that private investment requires public investment in order for it to happen, and we really do need to see a major ramping up of that. That is another major pressure for the new Secretary of State. And last but absolutely definitely not least on my little list here is the projected rates of poverty, of child poverty for children living in larger families. Basically, this is a chart showing you what happens if you have a 2-child limit. And what it's telling you is that half of all kids in larger families we think will be in poverty in about 3 or 4 years' time. It's already a very high proportion, but rising to half. That's a scandalous proportion for any country like us. And the point to kind of register here is that the numbers of kids affected by this policy is set to grow significantly during this Parliament. It's not just like an inherited thing. The scale of this policy is increasing as new kids get born into these families. This is a major social problem in our country. Obviously, it's a grade A political problem too, for this government to be presiding over that. So they are some of the challenges. I could have given you charts on prisons, courts. I could have shown you lots of other things which would have looked probably more challenging than the things I've just chosen. So that wasn't, I didn't think what are the 4 toughest things. I just thought, give you a rounded sense. So that's really, really hard, and they have got their work cut out. Does that mean I'm just kind of really gloomy, or we're all, this organisation is really gloomy about what can be achieved? I'm actually not. I'm glass half full, I would say. Why do I say that? Because just very briefly, I think, this notion of a stability dividend is a real thing. I don't think it's a kind of like wishful thing. I do think that it's not unreasonable to expect that if we have a period of stable government, we end lurching around, we have concerted purpose where people say they've got a plan and they stick to that plan and policy is consistent with it, then it's not going to solve all our problems clearly. But I don't think, I would expect that to unlock some domestic investment and actually attract, not least in quite a fast-moving and scary global situation, it would also attract a greater proportion of international investment too. So I feel quite upbeat about that. We've gone through a kind of ridiculous decade in terms of shocks. Some of it is self-harm in terms of Brexit, but some of it is not. So, COVID, cost of living crisis and so on. I'm not saying, that's the end of shocks. Shocks aren't like that, but I do think, we might reasonably expect the years ahead not to be quite as crisis-ridden as the years behind, and that has had massive impacts on levels of investment and much else in our country. So I think that gives me a degree of optimism. I mean, productivity performance is awful. The silver lining of that, and there is a bit of a silver lining, is that you don't have to be at the global frontier. You don't have to be the best in the world to do a lot better than we're doing in lots of sectors. You just need to catch up a bit with the people who are in that position. And I also think it's really material that our export performance in services, and we are basically an overwhelmingly service-dominated economy, has done pretty well. It's done much better than I would have expected, and that is a genuine source of optimism. Interest rates are very likely to come down. We don't know by how much, but we're likely to be living through a period of declining rates over the next few years. And we do have institutions in our country, like our schools and our universities, which are facing acute problems right now, and I do not underestimate them. But they do perform well compared to most, if not all, but most of our international peers. And that is vital. Like, lots of countries would give anything to have our universities. Lots of countries would give anything to have our recent PISA results in schools. So I think that is material. And I also just think there's just a lot of scope to do better. Public policy does matter to outcomes, and we can do a lot better in a whole set of areas, which really is my conclusion, which is the inheritance is incredibly tough. That is real. Anyone who says it's not, it's just talking nonsense. It is incredibly tough for any government. But let's not forget, I suppose, that many of the things we most need to act on, whether it's kind of political and institutional stability, whether it's some productivity catch-up, whether it's getting employment growth growing again, whether it's poverty reduction over a period of years incrementally, or whether it's getting people to believe in their public services again, those are all things that have happened in this country in the not-so-distant past, and I don't believe that they're not possible again. So that is my introduction to get us going. But I want to hear from guests, so I'm going to pass over to them as I sit down. Thanks, and Heather, you're going to go first.
I'm going to go first. Am I switched on?
You are. I think you are switched on. Yes,
quite loud anyway, so it should be fine. So this is going to be very sort of broad brush and focusing on the politics rather than the economics, because I'll try and leave those to Sam. But I have some reasons for optimism and then maybe some worries, I suppose. I was going to do it in that order. So one of the jobs I had last week in the run-up to the election was to look at to carefully read all of the pieces that our reporters, so we sent reporters out to 15 different constituencies around the country, constituencies that we thought told different kinds of stories about the sort of political situation. And one of my jobs was to go through them and say, okay, what can we learn from this? What are the messages? And one of the messages, there were lots of familiar messages which you would guess, surprise, surprise, the NHS is in a terrible state and nobody can get a doctor's appointment and all that stuff. But one of the things that really came through was just how low people's expectations are. So people felt things were in a terrible state, all of the things they hoped the state would do for them, whether it's health or libraries or, stopping people needing food banks, all of that stuff was in a terrible state, and they didn't really believe that it could be any better. So expectations, I think, are incredibly low. Now, there's a worry about that, which is, do you then trust anybody or do you believe anybody when they say they've made things better? But it's a hopeful sign in that, maybe you can make some quite small incremental changes and people will, you would hope, notice that and see that and think, oh, okay, maybe that's, maybe government can make a difference. And this is very much a message that you've heard a lot from Keir Starmer. But I do think that opens up potentially quite a bit of terrain for a government that can just look. In a sense, Gavin talked about a stability dividend. Well, I think, and he meant it in an economic sense, but I think in a political sense, if you can be a government that says it's going to do some things and then it, lo and behold, does those things, maybe you can turn around that, or start to turn around that sense of sort of disaffection, in that sense that nothing works and nothing is fixable and nothing is going to change. And that's a sort of political stability dividend, you would hope. And just to remove the sense of sort of chaos, so if someone who goes around the country and talks to voters and you say, what do you think about the Conservatives, or what do you think about the government? And that people sort of do this, sort of intake of breath before they start to sort of list the different reasons, whether it's Partygate or whether, and it's this sense of sort of chaos. And I do wonder whether, if you can just take the chaos out of it and look, competent and not keep changing your ministers every 5 minutes, and there's something there, I think, in terms of the politics of this sort of moment. And the early signs seem to be good. So one of the things that Keir Starmer's done is selected a shadow team. He's kept almost all of them in post. They've all spent a long time thinking hard about what they would do in government. A lot of them spent, obviously, many of them been on the backbenches through this whole period, and that's why you've got this sense that people are arriving with a real agenda. They've got a sense of what they want to do, and they've already started announcing this sort of steps. So there are things like removing the ban on onshore wind, changing planning guidance that they've said they were going to do, they've been able to do it, and they're talking that, they're already starting to lay things before Parliament and do those things. And I think that is encouraging in the sense that it tells you they've got a very specific list of things that they can achieve. And these are, they're quite incremental, a lot of these things, but the fact they've got people who've spent a lot of time thinking about it, they know what they want to do, and they're already doing it is, again, I think, probably quite a good sign. And I do think Gavin's right, there's been a lot of talk about what the sort of ideology of this government is. Is it just managerial? Is it just about we can do things better? We can, take politics out of your lives and stop arguing about rainbow lanyards and, maybe just do some governing. And that is part of it. That's a big part of it. And I think actually, probably a lot of voters would be quite relieved to not have to hear about rainbow lanyards or whatever, whatever bizarre culture war issue it is that it, tends to feel quite irrelevant to a lot of people if you can't get a doctor's appointment. But I do think there is a bit of a sort of ideological anchor, and there's something about, when you listen to what Keir Starmer says, there's something about working people. It's a bit of, it doesn't tend to talk about class, but I think there is a little core of class politics in there, actually. It's something about dignity and respect for working people and making work pay, and getting out of your life so that you can sort of get on. And I think there's something about, there are a lot of questions about where the politics of this government goes, I think, and how they handle different issues when things get difficult. And I think some of that idea gives you an idea about how they'll sort of tackle some of these issues about public services, about poverty, about other things as time goes on. So my worries, these are the worries. One of them, which I think is sort of in sort of Sam's basket in a way, is just the sheer scale of what they're facing, and you could see that on Gavin's charts. And we all know this, and it's the flip side of the fact that people have completely lost hope, right? The scale of the sort of destruction of the state of public services, of the things that people might hope a government would do for them, has been immense over the last sort of 5, 10, 14 years, and turning that around will be extremely difficult. And the question will be whether you can show, okay, we're moving in the right direction and this is where we're going, and would stick with us? And that, I think it'll have to be that kind of argument. It's certainly not going to be we'll fix the NHS in 5 years, let alone a lot of the more intractable problems that have barely even come up through this campaign. Social care, for example, Lib Dems talked about it a lot. I don't really know what Labour are going to do. I have no idea what the Tories thought they were going to do either. So, there's all kinds of things that will not be fixed, cannot be fixed in 5 years. And the argument will have to be, here's our plan, we've taken some steps, here's what we want to do next, here's where we're going with it. I worry about the fiscal constraints, and this is one for Sam really. I worry about those fiscal rules and the extent to which Labour will allow them to be a constraint. Lots of economists think that debt rule is not a great idea, particularly in an economy in which there are sort of proven emergency reasons for lots of investment. I'm not sure the bond markets would go mad if you said that we'll rewrite the debt rule, but that, I'll leave that to you, Sam. But I worry about the extent to which the fiscal constraints will come up against the politics, and I don't know who wins that argument, and I don't know what Rachel Reeves does in that moment, and I don't know what Keir Starmer. I don't know whether their project can remain united at that point if she's saying no, got to stick by the rules, you can't have any more money, and he's saying, well, hang on, we told people we fixed the NHS, we can't do it without more resources. I don't know where that goes, but I do think there will come moments where that clash will come, and it might come fairly soon. If you've got cabinet ministers saying, look, we've promised this, I can't do it within the constraints that you're giving me, and I certainly can't impose those spending cuts that you want. I've got colleagues who've written papers, who've written stories about maybe there are some tax rises that could happen. Maybe I don't know how you square the circle, but that's going to be a really big issue going forward. I worry also a bit about the political constraints. So one of my very good lobby colleagues, Jess Elgott, wrote a piece the other day, obviously well briefed by Labour, in which she was told they were going to govern in a permanent state of campaigning. And I sort of let out a little sigh when I read that. There's two ways of thinking about that, right? One is, if we're going to win the next general election, we need to show people that we've made their lives better when we've made their public services better, and that's what we need to focus on every single day, day after day. Okay, fine, I'm fine with that. If it's, as it was, for example, for the Johnson and to some extent with the Sunak governments, if it's we've got to win today's headlines every day, that is a problem for me, because it can make you very short-termist. And I worry a bit that some of the very senior figures in the senior and brilliant figures in the campaign, the Morgan McSweeneys and the Pat McFaddens, have been put in very senior positions in government. If they're going to hold Labour to its promises about public services and everything else, great. if they're going to start saying, oh God, we've done some focus groups in Watford and Swindon and actually this planning stuff's not that popular and people don't like it very much and maybe we should rein in a bit, or, you know, I'm a bit worried about reform in the, you know, in the northeast and maybe we should be a bit tougher on migration and, you know, from day to day or from week to week, I worry, because I think that there are big overarching problems and that's what they need to be focused on day after day after day. So I don't know how these political problems are going to be resolved, but they are big.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Heather. And you gave us some light as well as some shade, so that is always welcome. Yeah, a little bit. For The Guardian, I think it was a pretty... Sam, how's it looking on the economics?
Yeah, I'll try and do a bit of light and shade as well. I suppose, I mean, the thing which has surprised me most about this new government is actually how few surprises there have been in terms of policy so far. And they may be privately talking about governing in a kind of campaigning way, but actually it's been relatively technocratic. I think what we've seen so far from the Labour government, I think that's a positive thing. I've spent more or less 10 years outside the UK, only came back towards the end of last year. And my job was focused on the US and then on the EU. But I did watch, obviously, with great interest what was going on back home. And there was a real sense that the reputation of the UK as a sort of stable, sensible place for policy making was degenerating, and that you really felt that most acutely in Brussels during the negotiations for exit and then the TCA. And so I think a sense that of stability actually does really matter. And I think that in a sense, if the new government comes in and starts doing what it said it would do, then that is actually really a positive in itself. So, and that's what we certainly saw from Rachel Reeves with the planning. I mean, it's kind of the strident first speech of a new chancellor about planning. I mean, that is saying something. It's unusual, but it actually does really matter. And if you're thinking about the supply side, then that is something that you could start to see yielding dividends. The Wealth Fund, again, about trying to marshal a private sector investment in an area of highly constrained public finances. It makes sense as a policy. I suppose that the criticism, obviously, is the backdrop to this new government is a real reluctance on the part of both parties, but the one we care about now is Labour, to be honest about the fiscal inheritance, which we've just seen in front of us. And I think that we will start to see we're already starting to see the narrative switch from growth will save us, which is what Rachel Reeves was effectively saying on the fiscal side during the election campaign, to some pretty brutal truth-telling, which is now what we're hearing with talk about the broken NHS, Keir Starmer talking about the broken prison system, and then this spending assessment, which Rachel Reeves announced on the beginning of her first full week in office, which is a slightly mysterious thing, but it's going to happen before the recess. There was some discussion beforehand in the city and elsewhere as to whether the Labour government would commission an interim forecast from the OBR, which could be put out on its own merits, effectively spelling out the inheritance, because otherwise your first forecast is basically you own it if it's released at the time of the budget, and so you have to, in a sense, absorb the bad news as part of what you have to offer. But if you spell out something separate, then you can at least begin to explain that a lot of what's going wrong is not necessarily your fault as a new government. And I suspect there's a timeline involved in trying to get it from the OBR, so it's going to be a Treasury-driven document. It doesn't look like it's a mini spending review or anything like that. I think it's a very political exercise indeed, but it's all about, as I said, reshaping the narrative ahead of what I think is going to be a really, really tough budget after, I suspect, well, definitely after the party conferences later this year. So the reason, I mean, we've already seen the reason why that is going to be a tough budget. I think it's worth bearing in mind that we do have some slightly more positive GDP numbers coming at the moment, and so the first quarter was relatively strong. The numbers this morning were also pretty strong, about twice expectations. This is in the context of very low GDP growth historically, but still better than expected. And so you can start to think about some upside risk to the OBR's 2024 forecast of 0.8% GDP growth. I mean, you could be looking at north of 1% easily, I think, this year. So a cyclical upturn, I think, could be quite a positive tailwind for the new government. And so we do have good news on that front, really driven by the fact that we do now finally have real income growth, real wage growth, thanks to the low 2% inflation and continued improvements in wages. So the really grim picture that we just saw in terms of the last Parliament on incomes is beginning, at least they're showing signs of turning around. The problem is, as we've heard, the OBR's quite optimistic view of trend growth and productivity. And so it's really difficult to see what Labour could announce in the next few months, which would compel the OBR to be even more positive about potential growth than it already is. I mean, if you think about their potential growth forecast for 28 is 1.6%. That's relatively toppy. The long-term trend growth forecast for the IMF is around 1.3. NISA has about 1. It's a toppy forecast. Now, David Miles from the OBR has obviously been questioned on this recently by the Treasury Committee. He said, well, productivity growth is so catastrophically bad for the past 15 years that eventually we've just taken a view that it'll bounce back. And maybe it will. But that, I don't think, is going to be a judgment they can really form in terms of actually boosting it even further in the coming few months. So you can then say, well, Labour will put through some supply-side measures, and that could be helpful for the OBR situation. The problem is that planning, as we know, is a really tough thing, a tough nut to crack. It takes a long time to actually see whether these measures will bear fruit. And so far, I would not call what we've seen on planning from the Labour government particularly radical. It's sensible, but it's not particularly radical. Then there's this really intractable problem of inactivity and labour force participation and the important role that's going to play in any hope for a higher trend growth forecast from the OBR. We have seen the OBR's willingness to score some of the labour market measures of Jeremy Hunt, so they're open to dynamic scoring when this stuff, when it comes to government measures. But again, it's just very difficult to see why the trend growth forecast will be lifted. And so in that context, we're going to have a really tough budget. And so I think that that is going to be where we really drive towards in terms of coverage now for the next few months. Now, there are, like Heather, I'd like to offer a few positives. I think the stability dividend, as I said earlier on, does matter. I think speaking to investors the past few days, they do put some weight on the sense that the UK has now got a relatively stable government, a relatively stable, which is fiscally conservative and sensible, and that in the context of a European Union where there are a lot of unknowns, and especially France, our nearest neighbour, in real political turmoil. I think you've started to hear that from Labour figures. There is a sense that could be a positive. The flip side to that, of course, is that if the EU is doing bad economically, we end up doing bad economically as well. So I wouldn't take too much comfort from that. Also, as an addendum, the US was starting to hear noises from the Fed about a downturn in the labour market. So if the US economy begins to soften, then I wouldn't get too excited about a cyclical upturn. What can happen then if there isn't going to be growth, which saves them on the budget side? There is the possibility, as Heather alluded to, of some changes on the fiscal rules side. One particular area which I'm watching very closely is the idea of how the losses from the rundown of quantitative easing are accounted for and whether some changes in that area, which get into the realms of technical, we can talk about them, could actually help the debt picture. I mean, it's all about accounting, it's not reality, but it does make a difference in terms of the fiscal picture. But overall, I can't, as we sit here today, really see why we'd expect a lot more headroom, given Labour has taken the existing debt falling rule on a 5-year horizon, the existing headroom of just under 9 billion. Why would that be radically larger when the budget is announced later this year? It's not obvious why that would be a lot harder. And so we're going to have a really tough budget, as I said, to conclude. And right, in short, there is a softening up exercise right now about the grim fiscal reality we're going to get this autumn, which really ought to have started sooner. But that's what's now fully underway.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam. I know we're going to come back to that, and it sets Nick up nicely in terms of the fiscal outlet. Before I just pass on to Nick, I know that some of our people watching online are struggling with the sound. I don't know if we know that or not. Yeah, you're trying to. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. I should say one of the more curious things of the campaign, just to pick up on what Sam said there, is that Reform became the party of heterodox economics and said that they would not, the Treasury should not indemnify the Bank of England on its losses on quantitative tightening. And I have to say that was not something I expected. I want to say just a few things briefly on the nature of the election result and what it might mean for the coming months. The first is that Labour won right across the United Kingdom. This was not just a Labour landslide, it was a decisive nationwide rejection of the Conservative Party. Its worst result, certainly since 1906, 24% of the vote, but it's right across the UK. And that means that the politics of territorial governance, of how we govern the nations, the cities, the counties, the towns, Scotland to the south, Wales and so on, will become very, very important in this Parliament. The Conservatives, trying to hold together their coalition of support in 2019 with their levelling up agenda, ended up with a sort of political economy, a kind of potholes, high street, tightening up and doing up, a sort of politics, if you like, of small pots of funding for local government. That catastrophically failed, but it spoke to the need and the difficulty of holding together a coalition across the different territories of the United Kingdom. We've seen Starmer already making it his first business to go and visit Scotland and Wales to bring the English mayors into number 10. And I think that is an indication of the importance of this question of territorial governance to what will happen. It's about spending and how it's distributed, the Barnett formula and other measures. It's about where net zero investment projects go, where they are invested in the country. It's about protecting workers and jobs in places like Port Talbot, in Grangemouth, Harland and Wolff in Belfast. It's about the relationship between the centre and the nations, the Sewell Convention, all the ways in which the union is held together. And it's about deepening of devolution policy in England too. So these dimensions of policy are, I think, going to be very, very important. And one of the sort of political challenges for Labour is how it speaks to a sense of the United Kingdom when there are very now different and distinct national identities that have emerged within it. An appeal to Britishness will not work any longer. So how they think about that, the kind of character, the positioning, the identity of the party will be very important. And in this, the South will be very interesting because of housing and planning, also because of things like the material politics of transmission pylons and data centres, power stations and where they go. And these issues, of course, are pressing, not just because of those sorts of questions of policy, but because in 2026 we have another set of elections in Wales and Scotland. And as Heather says, the people in the Starmer project who have been empowered in the last couple of years are the election strategists, the political strategists. They will be thinking already about those 2026 elections. Labour also won big because of lots of Liberal Democrat, Labour tactical voting. And that's obviously the reason why there's such a disproportionate relationship between vote share and seats for both of those parties. If you like, voters overcame the famous progressive dilemma of David Markham's, of the split between the liberal and socialist and social democratic traditions, which made it very hard to overcome a Tory majority. And the question for Labour is how you sustain that electoral coalition in circumstances at the next election when the imperative is not to remove the Conservative Party from office, when you're an incumbent party at that point, and you have to give people positive reasons for wanting to vote tactically to sustain you in office. My view is that, in the past, obviously, a lot of that Lib-Lab cooperation has been around constitutional and democratic reform. The Labour manifesto was conservative and modest on those sorts of questions. It might be that they want to open up more of a second-term agenda with the Liberal Democrats on those questions, but they should also look to very material and pressing challenges like social care, as Heather mentioned. It's a big issue. You can't really solve it on a collective level without tapping into some of the wealth of older people in the south of England. That's where your Lib-Lab cooperation comes in political economy terms rather than simply policy terms. So that is an important question, it seems to me, for both Labour strategy and its relationship to policy. The other issue in terms of place, of course, is local government. Gavin mentioned in his presentation, it could have gone on for a long time on the difficult issues that we face, but local government is clearly one of them. Councils going bust, Section 114s, lots of councils given permission to spend capital on revenue to get them through recent months. Lots of pressures there. And the wider point about the next spending review is, of course, if you carry on cutting non-protected departments, they end up at the door of local government, homelessness, other sorts of problems, special educational needs, and they end up at the door of your protected departments. Yep. If you cut local government children's services, you end up cutting what happens in schools, you put pressure on schools, same with social care and the NHS, and so on. So these areas of unprotected policy do need to be resolved, and that brings me, I'll be quick, that brings me to some points about the spending review. As Sam said, that will dominate the autumn and beyond. I think to make real the pledge that there will be no return to austerity, you need to think about flat real for all departments. That's an incredible stretch, as Gavin showed. It implies some tax increases. I also think it's important that Labour does not try to do a 3-year comprehensive spending review in the 3 months before the autumn. There should be a 1-year spending settlement alongside the budget. It's not just a technocratic rollover exercise either. That will involve a lot of negotiation and high politics in Whitehall to get to that point. And the other thing is that Labour has lots of gaps in its policy programme. There are 14 reviews in its manifesto. You can't do a 3-year spending review against a backdrop of policy you don't know what to fund. I mean, you need to know the policy framework that you're funding over 3 years. So to try to do a 3-year settlement when you've got so much policy to develop, I think, is very problematic. The converse point is if you want to achieve measurable improvements by the end of the Parliament, you need to start spending now, early in the Parliament. That's true of capital projects, which always take longer to develop and deliver than policymakers think, but it's really important also on service delivery and on poverty reduction. And today we have the latest statistics on the impact of the 2-child limit on child poverty. The child poverty statistics on which the next election will be fought are likely to be those for 26-27, i.e. 1 year on from next year's settlement. So if you're going to do something about child poverty, you have to do it early in the Parliament. You can't wait until the end. Finally, on mission government, Labour has come into power with a strong focus on 5 key missions, covering education, health, home affairs, and so on. It's a big part of how it's thinking about restructuring Whitehall with mission boards, mission delivery units, and so on. A lot of things have been written about mission government. Lots of it is quite unhelpful. Missions don't cover the things that you want to do in a spending review. You can't structure a spending review around missions because you have to allocate to departments. You can do cross-cutting reviews, but you can't do a mission spending review per se. There are lots of other issues that aren't covered by missions, which are incredibly politically fraught, things like small boat crossings, defence and security. They're outside the purview of missions. And the key thing I want to say in this area is that a lot of the structure in Whitehall of mission government will be about delivery of policy. The assumption is you've got a policy framework across these different areas which you are delivering and you're making your mission. The big gap is how you do strategic policy development, how you think about new policy, particularly in the medium term when you've done a lot of your manifesto quickly in the first year, which I think will be the case. Now, the Blair government got to that in its second term through things like the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, which Gavin was the Deputy Director of. It did big reviews like the Turner Commission review of pensions, the Wanless review of the NHS. It found ways of equipping itself to be strategic and forward-looking in policy. I think the Starmer government has to get there too. It can't just rely on the new structure of mission government to do that. And the final point is this, is that the last Labour government left behind some important institutions, the Low Pay Commission, devolved government, Scotland, Wales and so on, but it tended not to think about how it housed its policy ambitions within new institutions, as the NHS had been or the BBC had been. And that means you're vulnerable to cuts and withdrawal of benefits and services, public spending and so on. And I think if you're thinking of a decade of renewal, if you're thinking of a decade of policy, you should be thinking about what are the institutions you're building, which people have a stake in, where services are delivered, where people live a common life, which you leave behind you, things like children's centres and so on. You can think of all sorts of areas where that's the case, but a lot more thinking has to go into the institutional framework of what a Labour government tries to achieve, and not just into, and this is the danger with mission government, a set of annual targets and performance measures, or the kind of campaigning-led policy that Heather warned about too. So there's a sort of final point on statecraft, which I think needs some careful thought.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. So much in that. I hope people at home could hear that. Paula, over to you. Give us a sense of where the electorate is at on all this and how it feeds into this debate.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me again. The rest of the panel have talked a lot about policy and challenges, and my expertise is very much on voters' attitudes and behaviour. So I'm going to frame my response around voters. And I sat actually where Heather's sitting now in 2019 and said, in a room that was fairly depressed, that the Conservatives would disappoint their new voters. And maybe you only get lucky ones, maybe I was just lucky. But I think that Labour might surprise voters, and that might be the story of this Parliament. So I'd expected, you get asked to write lots of things just after an election, and I'd sort of sat down, well, what will I write? What will I say? What am I expecting? And I'd expected to write about a voter coalition that was quite broad, that would be difficult to hold together. And in fact, it isn't really at all. At 34%, it's not a particularly broad coalition. I thought I'd write about the challenge from the left, that Labour would risk losing votes to the Greens and Independents over the course of the Parliament. But lots of those voters chose to vote Labour anyway. And I thought there'd be a challenge holding on to voters that Labour had won over from the Conservatives, but actually it turned out they won over rather fewer of those than we might have expected this time last year. Now, why were those two groups smaller? The Greens and the Independents. We'll have to wait a little while until we've got really good data to dig into people's voter motivations. Whether that was a case of those voters seeing this election as something as a free hit, almost the kind of protest that you might see at a by-election because they thought the result was a foregone conclusion, or are we seeing an unravelling of a coalition that was brought together during the Corbyn years? Corbyn's Labour was very successful at bringing into the Labour voter coalition those voters that had previously been voting Green. It was hugely successful at winning over what I term the liberal left. It was winning 75, 80, 90% of that vote. That wasn't helping it in terms of seats, but it may be that that's a permanent unravelling rather than just that kind of sense of a free hit, and we'll need to look at that when we get data. It's not something I can do with what we have at the moment. The second point is that Reform did hurt Labour. Now, Reform don't take many Labour votes from those that had voted Labour in 2019. But what they did was provide an outlet for Conservative voters to switch to that prior to Reform saying they would stand everywhere, were saying they might switch to Labour. So looking back at some YouGov polling, October last year of the 2019 Conservatives, 16% said they'd vote Labour, 16% said they'd vote Reform. By November, that was an 18-20 split, but last week, that was more like 10 or 12% to Labour and 25% to Reform. Absolutely devastating for the Conservatives, but it meant that it hurt Labour a little bit as well. And those voters switched for the same reasons, and I think this is quite important. Those that voted Conservative in 2019 that switched either to Labour or Reform gave exactly the same reasons for switching, that the Conservatives were out of touch, untrustworthy and incompetent. The difference was they had different policy priorities. And those that voted for, that switched from Conservative to Reform, immigration is just almost the only thing on their policy agenda. 60% of Reform voters say immigration is the most important issue. You don't get, even amongst kind of Labour who say NHS, you only get to sort of 40, 50%. It's such a concentrated and single issue vote at the moment. Whether or not they can do anything with that is a question for a different panel. And also, the other thing that affected Labour was non-voting, which I want to come back to at the end. Now, I want to just talk briefly about the expectations that people have of this government and sort of set that against the sort of challenges that the panel have been setting out. To some extent, tax rises are expected. Okay? 56% of the electorate say they expect taxes to be higher under Labour. That's about a third of Labour voters. People expect welfare spending to go up as well. There are some things that those that voted Labour are a bit more positive about. 64% of those that voted Labour suggest that more houses will get built. 40% think mortgage rates will go down. About half think that unemployment will fall. And the really, really key thing that voters expect under a Labour government is that the NHS will improve. 3/4 of those who voted Labour think the NHS will improve under Labour. And that, I think, is going to be a place where if you can show real change that people feel in their day-to-day lives, you will be seen as meeting expectations, possibly even exceeding them in some areas. But there are also really significant groups of voters who just think it doesn't make a difference. They don't think Labour will change things one way or the other. They think things will go on much the same as they have been, but with the kind of caveat that there's a real sense that it can't be worse. So actually, again, expectations are quite low. So the kinds of incremental changes that Heather was talking about might be enough to give people some faith and confidence in the government from quite an early stage. And that brings me to my final point, which is about disengagement. Turnout in this election was low, and I was wrong about that. I expected turnout to hold up much, much better than it did. Again, I'm a bit kind of sitting around waiting for data. It's probably a good thing I'm going on holiday soon, and hopefully it will have come by the time I come back.
Everyone needs a holiday.
Understanding that low turnout, I think, is important, not just for us as academics, of course, we're interested in it, but for parties and those interested in politics, I think it's going to be really important to understand that. We know that voter ID made a bit of a difference. There was lots of reports also about postal votes not turning up in time. So probably, had those two things not happened, we might have seen turnout get above that 60% threshold. It might not looked quite as bad, but it would still have been low. I wrote a piece, I've lost track, I don't even know what day it is anymore, but I wrote a piece a couple of days ago, and I said, given the chance to kick out a really unpopular government, huge numbers of people just went, meh, sat on their hands, didn't bother. And I think that's something that we need to understand. And I've heard endlessly that there's no enthusiasm for Labour line. And it's maybe that's the case. Maybe Labour didn't enthuse enough people. I'm less convinced by that as a line. Starmer is as popular as Johnson was. It's just different. He doesn't turn as many people on, but he doesn't turn as many people off. So we've got a different kind of politics. Some of the work I've looked at previously on turnout suggests that turnout is lower, not necessarily when elections are uncompetitive, but when parties are perceived as being quite similar. So it's possible that some of the Labour Party approach during the campaign to say that they would match spending cuts, match pledges and so on, might have led to them being perceived as quite similar. And that lack of polarisation, I think, goes into that as well. But I think there's something deeper that people need to address. I think it goes beyond what people think about particular political parties. Huge numbers of people just say that government is going to make no difference. It doesn't matter which government's in power, things will go on much the same. People expect things to just carry on regardless. And Starmer's used this idea in a number of speeches now of treading lightly on people's lives, which I think was brilliant at the time because people had this kind of period of chaos, a period, you might perhaps have described the Truss, I call it the Truss interlude, as stomping on people's lives rather than treading gently on it. But I think in government, it's going to be necessary to do things that make people's lives better, that people can feel a positive difference. And crucially, to make voters believe that it was the government that did that it was the government that made the difference. And then they might start to reconnect with politics and believe that politics can actually make their lives better, not just different.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paula. Really, really insightful comments on how to understand the results that we've all been sort of pondering over. So thank you. Right. So I'm going to ask a few quick fire questions to the panel to kick things around a bit, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready. Let's just start, Sam, on economics, but other people jump in on the panel other than Sam if they want to. We've heard, it is striking that how, the first Chancellor, I can't remember ever a first outing from a Chancellor so strong on something like planning reform, which is really, really hard. Lots of history of failure. Lots of people don't really understand. They kind of, it's quite technical. And she was very strong in it, Rachel Reeves. Just to take that, but also put that together with the other things that we know that on the kind of supply side of the economy that they're sort of interested in doing, obviously house building, but also kind of closer, in a very incremental, cautious way, closer ties, trade ties with the EU and so on. Yeah. what does it add up to in your view? If you take a relatively optimistic view of that, how much difference could that stuff make over a parliament?
Yeah, it can definitely make and we've done quite a lot on planning recently. It can definitely make a difference. And certainly big booms in the past have been associated with lots of house building.
Yep.
So house building drives economic activity, and it shows up relatively quickly. It doesn't take that long to build new houses. The problem is it takes too long to get them planned out. And so if they can compress those timelines, it definitely will help. Part of the problem in terms of the quantity of houses, the number of houses being built, is the biggest house building booms have effectively been largely or in significant measure be publicly driven housing rather than privately driven housing, and there's lots of reasons to expect to temper your expectations, including the chart you put up, which is just history is really not on their side. So I think it's the right thing to be trying, but I wouldn't get my hopes too high as that it will yield quick results. On the EU, I'm afraid I am probably more glass half empty than glass half full when it comes to the potential for big strides forward in terms of EU relations. Partly just because I don't think there's a huge appetite right now in Brussels for a big re-engagement with the UK on the fundamentals of its deal with Brussels. There's an enormous period of political upheaval going on right now in the EU. They need a new commission to be embedded. France is not going to be a driver and Germany is also not proven to be a driver on the economic agenda in the EU as well. So I think there's potential for modest steps on the EU, but I don't think again it's going to show up in big numbers in terms of the actual growth forecast.
Some scope for improvement on growth rates over a parliament, but nothing huge based on what you've heard so far.
Yep.
Fine. And so the next question, and then we'll move on to sort of the politics of the coming budget, Heather. But on the economics of this, so I took you to be pessimistic about the prospect of getting the OBR to take account of your bit of optimism about growth, because it's kind of working through mechanisms that they don't generally tend to incorporate in their fiscal outlook.
Well, I think my main point on the OBR is just that it's very optimistic already.
Yes.
And there's been a lot more discussion this year about the potential for them to come down, and did that in itself argue or push the Conservatives away from trying to get an extra fiscal event in this year, because they were concerned actually there was downside risk to the trend.
I think the way this debate plays out is not that they'd be, in my mind, is not that they'd be increasing their current outlook. It's more like might they be encouraged to not reduce it?
I think that's
because there's some
that's
new
the
stuff
battle as I see it.
That seems to be okay. And how do you think that's going to play out?
I suppose I don't know. Instinctively, I would be surprised if the OBR greeted a brand new government with a massive downgrade to their productivity forecast. Because why now, in a sense?
It's quite a hello present, but yes. Heather, kind of related to this, but just and it's just sort of in a way throw about the dilemma you were posing. Which that when it comes to there is a strategic sort of dilemma here for this new government, which is it's implicitly, if not explicitly, been elected on a kind of mandate of the public realm is in a terrible condition, the economy is in a terrible condition. These two things are related, but we're going to improve your NHS and so on, and that's what that's what you're going to get. And so they are obviously going to be seized with that takes time. We need to act quickly to get results ahead of another election down the road, and that's going to take money. That's one kind of view of the world, and that's difficult. But that's just sort of how we see it against another view of the world, which is people are absolutely sick with being told one thing by people who want to be in power and then come in and act in a slightly different way. Massive fear of there they go again, another party coming in saying they weren't going to do stuff on taxes, and here. You can see that, and I think I think that is deeply felt too. I think very deeply felt. And I have no idea how that's going to play out, but it feels to me that's kind of a central sort of framing for the new government in terms of how it acts. Is that right? And how do you see that playing out?
I think it is right, and it kind of makes me worry, because I think you're right that if you do really want to make inroads into a lot of these issues, you are going to need to invest up front. Yeah. Even the Tories were accepting that if you need to improve productivity in the NHS, you're going to have to. That was Terence Hunt's, wasn't it? You have to invest up front, even if you think technology is your saviour, and maybe it does help with productivity in the public services. You're still going to have to spend some money on it up front in order to make it work. And I suppose I worry that we've got to keep all our promises bit wins out for the first couple of years, despite the fact that this is your moment of maximum power,
Yeah.
and then in year 3,
You do the difficult. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, hopefully they've thought all this through, right? And you could see the spending review, whatever it is they're doing. What are they calling
Assessment
it?
or-
Spending assessment, whatever they're calling this sort of document of doom they're going to put out before the summer. You could see that as paving the way for, 10 years worth of look what a mess the Tories left everything in. Could see it as paving the way for taking some,
Difficult decisions.
doing some stuff on tax
Yeah.
in the autumn, or couldn't you? I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
Well,
know. And there are things that they've studiously not ruled out on
Yes.
tax. Aren't
Yes.
there?
Yeah. We noticed.
Yeah.
So there are some things, although there's an awful lot. I think 70% of the tax take was
Yeah, right.
covered in
Smaller
one
things. Yeah.
form. If you look at historically, and this is not a prediction, but if you look historically, then I think I'm right in saying it's kind of low to mid 20 billions is the normal increase in the tax take that you see in the 2 fiscal events following
Right.
a general election,
Right.
and that applies equally, basically across party.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so that's just a sort of.
Well, the Tories would,
Yeah,
might well
so
have done it, right?
so that's an interesting. But I think
The
I
Tories would have
feel.
done those spending cuts.
I feel like it's not at all. I don't know where that's going to come out. Actually, is my view. Nick, just let's just pick up on that. And by the way, my question for you, given the sort of nature of the governing challenges we face as a country, how does a government that's both in some ways cautious and incremental, but has got this thumping majority, use that moment to deal with both the short-term pressures that everyone knows about, like things are broken and they need fixing quickly, at the same time as, if you have a majority, it is an opportunity that does not come along that often in this country to deal with really big public policy conundrums like social care, like what on earth are we going to do about kind of, our vehicles and moving towards kind of road charging of some sort, which I know everyone's just like, oh my God, but at some point someone's going to do it. Local authority funding formula, local authorities raising revenue. There are big things that most people who work in public policy think are absolutely broken, that it takes a government of big majority to have a run at. Can this government do the short-term stuff it needs to do to fix immediately broken things whilst doing those long-term things?
Yeah, I mean, in some areas, the short-term measures are obvious. I mean, we're about to get, prisoner releases from our prisons because they're full, and so there will be a formula that you serve 40% of your sentence and then you're released. They're going to announce that tomorrow. In the realm, something like higher education, you can stabilise the higher education sector if you allow the tuition fee to go up a little bit. You don't clamp down further on overseas migration. There'll be measures you can take in the shorter term that can address those sorts of questions. They don't solve the really big tax and spend questions which are coming at the budget and which you've just discussed. I mean, those are, they are very, very big political questions, and lots of this can't be solved unless they are addressed in the budget, at least in the first instance, as I say, a sort of one-year review alongside your budget. On the longer-term issues, I mean, as I say, I think because of the kind of vulnerabilities in the electoral voting bloc, that's where I do see there being a role for trying to expand your coalition of consensus on things like social care, where you say, not that you kick it into a royal commission and you make it a kind of elite establishment exercise. You do it much more in a kind of open political way, where you're trying to bind people into some of the big answers to these things, and where you're trying to share the challenge with them. And social care is a very real one in that respect. I think the same is true of combined authorities and devolving more powers to combined authorities and entrenching them as a key building block of English devolution. And it will need to be local authorities and combined authorities, particularly in the south of England, that take on the challenge of house building and giving permissions to pylons and all the rest of it that go through. And if they don't do so, then the national government will do as Rachel Reeves has been saying, put things into the national framework, say their national decisions, call more things in, etc. So if you don't get that local and devolved politics right, it'll end up back at the national level as well. So I think it's partly about the sort of levels of government, it's partly about the coalitions you build, and it's partly about deliberately thinking strategically about what will sustain a reforming government, not just the reforms you have to make.
Interesting. And of course, interesting on your social care point, that is the one issue where the Lib Dems really did do a good job in raising that issue and getting people to talk about it and think about it. And, they didn't sort of answer it, but they certainly were the party that put it front and centre. So that in a way, it kind of lends itself to that issue. Paula, I had to kind of on the kind of where the electorate is at and how that plays into this discussion that we're having about governing. I mean, one thing I've heard a lot is that we have a very, very large number of Labour MPs with very small majorities. Now, we have a very large number of Labour MPs. You could just end the sentence there, right? But we do have a high proportion of them are sitting on, you know, and a lot of them probably didn't expect to be elected, you know, at least a year ago and so on. So I don't know how we answer that. How much do you think that affects the kind of mood of the government? Is one thing. Like, do they govern with a large majority, but thinking, God, you know, 100 of our people have got majorities smaller than whatever the number is not that big. So that was one thought. And the second thought is really Heather's point, which she started with, which is you mentioned sort of about expectations a bit, but where do you think, and it will vary, I know, but where do you think the public are at in terms of how quickly they expect to feel a material difference in order to feel that this government has in some sense been worth giving a go in a serious way? Like, what's your read on that?
So on the small majorities, I mean, yeah, I do think it changes the perspective, and I think the share of the vote changes the perspective as well.
Yeah.
It does change how you think about the electorate. It can't not. But I think it also removes some of the challenges in some ways. I mean, you don't have to try and keep all these voters happy because they've already gone.
If some of them are not.
So it doesn't matter whether they're happy or not, really, because they weren't part of your coalition in the first place. So I think in that sense, it reduces some of the challenges. It makes some of them more acute. And I don't think we really know, I don't know, and I think anybody that tells you they do is probably lying, what the party system is going to look like at the next election. It may be, if we keep the fragmentation that we currently have, 34% starts to look like a very good share of the vote. You know, if all these parties stay roughly where they are, the Conservatives pick up a little bit. Actually, it's not that far below what Cameron got in 2015 under a similar sort of electoral landscape. If you think about the kind of SNP and Lib Dems swapping places a little bit in that coalition, so it's quite similar. So I just don't think we know how that's going to play out. And you know, I spent lots of this campaign saying there were no safe seats for the Conservatives, and in the same sense, I think, you know, small majorities might not matter. We just don't know. We just really don't know how that's going to play out.
Interesting.
It's going to be really important to be able to tell some sort of story, isn't it, about this is what the government is about, this is what it's done, and this is how it's made a difference to you, and this is how you can see it. Like, there's a really crass way of doing that, isn't there? Like, do you remember Eat Out to Help Out, where Rishi Sunak literally had a signature? You'd go and there'd be a sticker on the door of the restaurant, and it'd have Rishi Sunak's. I mean, it didn't work out that well in the end, let's face it. But you know, there's a sort of crass way of doing that, which is like to badge everything. But it's can you tell some sort of a story about this is the sort of country we're trying to create, and this is the difference that we've made.
And some of those differences have to be visible. Let's be honest.
Yes.
They have to be very visible.
Yes.
Right. Time is not a friend here, so we're going to open it up. We've got a mic here. We're going to take a group of questions. There's a lady at the back with glasses on, and then there's a gentleman to her side, and there's a gentleman front row. We'll take, if your questions could be pithy and punchy.
Hi, I'm from the Safe Sick Pay campaign. So we're arguing that statutory sick pay needs to be increased. It's currently just very, very low. It's less than a quarter of the real living wage, the lowest across Europe. With everything you've said today about needing to make a tangible difference to people's lives, things that voters will feel, and also challenges around productivity, would you agree that's something the new government should be looking at?
Okay, sick pay, yep. There's a gentleman, yeah, there you go.
Thank you. On fiscal rules, always a favourite subject. I'd be interested to know whether Paula finds any evidence of either them or the whole tough talking on budgets cutting through to the electorate. If it doesn't cut through to the electorate, who are they aimed at? Because in the city, they see the flaws. Obviously, they're too sophisticated. Is it really the Nick McPherson point, which is it's all about being able to go into meetings with departments and being able to say, we can't give you more money. And it doesn't really matter where you draw the rules. We just need a hard line for negotiating.
Okay, thank you. There's the gentleman here in the front row.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the panel, by the way. It's really interesting. I'm Martin Niger, and I work for a communications consultancy called Foretold. And I want to drag every member of the panel into the answer here, because we heard that from Sam that it was going to be a really tough budget. We heard, I think, principally from Nick, but not only Nick, that the government needs to spend a lot of money very early to achieve impact, but they can't borrow, and surely they can't raise a lot of taxes in budget number one. I mean, that would be a real political killer. And then we heard from Heather that it might be very slow progress in the first term, and by the end of the first term it would still be kind of, we're getting there but we haven't got there yet. I would have thought that's a pretty open goal for Project Farage, basically, isn't it? He says he's going to come after Labour, and Labour will therefore be giving him a big opportunity to get a lot of angry people to vote for him.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I thought, because of the time, I think we're going to take a couple more, because we might not, so there's two gentlemen. If there's anyone who's not a gentleman, I know, I'm just trying to, okay, let's, I've now been rude to the audience.
It's a quick question for Nick. Piers Williamson, you talked about Labour in Scotland, doing well in Scotland, and clearly it's strong in Wales as well. Northern Ireland is a bit of a, I don't understand what the Labour Party does about Northern Ireland.
Okay, and we're going to take this gentleman here, and then
Thanks
take two more, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Sorry, Terry O'Neill, Temple, we do planning environment. This is probably a question more for Labour in its second term, but I think a lot of the themes that are coming up around funding and taxation might be material here. Previous Labour administrations were quite keen on devolution within England.
Yep.
And regional devolution, if it was done in a way that allowed local taxation, to form part of the conversation, and therefore to ameliorate some of the issues that we're talking around the fiscal restraints at the moment, constraints. Just the views of the panel on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, so there was a lady over there, and then this gentleman patiently in the front row.
Thank you. Sam Wilding from University Superannuation Scheme. It's quite a mouthful, I know. The panel expressed some skepticism about commissions. I think you called them elitist. I can't remember the exact words used.
It was the Royal Commission. It wasn't. Yeah, it was a specific point, I think.
Right, but back in I think it was 2005, the Turner Commission was established. That ultimately it took many years, but resulted in auto-enrollment on pensions, which has been seen as very successful. Are there any policy areas where you would think a commission could be valuable?
Yeah, good question. And then we're just going to pass to this gentleman in the front row, and then that is enough questions. That's a lot.
Yeah, Neil Cobbold from Repeat. We're in the property sector. And my one is with an electorate at the moment that are quite disillusioned, I think is what's come across, and what a government can achieve. How do they match some of their policies that they've put out with things like your stats on net zero? How much will the electorate allow net zero policy if it impacts them, with particular view to housing? Ed Miliband is due to make a statement next week regarding bringing us up to meet net zero by 2030. How do they balance that if we're coming out of a cost of living crisis, if they do something that is seen to make people worse to meet a net zero target? How do they keep that sentiment together?
Great. Thank you. Now, it won't surprise you to hear that our speakers are not going to all answer every one of those questions. And we won't do them all justice, but they're a good set of questions, so we'll give it our best go. I'm going to take the first one very quickly, which is sick pay. I think is massively important. It's one of those things that no one ever really talks about until we had COVID, and then suddenly everyone was like, why don't we have a sick pay system? The new government has committed to doing something on it. I'm not optimistic it will be an early priority for extra spending, but I have a degree of optimism that it will be part of the package that they come forward with in terms of kind of New Deal for workers. So that was my view on that one. Sam, just pick up on the fiscal question, and my spin on that is just like, how much space do they really have to sort of evolve the fiscal rules? The gentleman's sort of saying, who really cares in the public? So who does care? Why does it matter, briefly? And how much space do you think they've got to evolve the current framework?
I mean, I think they had to be strident on the political rules fiscal rules, given what came before, not only in terms of the Truss era, but also the fact that Labour had a reputation which you need to fight against, that it would be more likely to ramp up taxes and spending. So I think it was probably right politically for them to be pretty strident, as I hinted. I think there is room for manoeuvre in some of the details of the fiscal rules when it comes to accounting for quantitative tightening by the Bank of England. They have created this new rule, which is the current budget rule, to give themselves room for more investment. Unfortunately, the binding rule right now is the debt falling rule, debt falling as a share of GDP, so it doesn't really give them anything as things stand. So I think they've kind of tied their hands pretty tightly on fiscal rules, and I can't see how they can really move in a substantial way. I actually do think that there is room for them to borrow more for investment. Certainly people we've spoken to in the city think they have a bit more latitude than they give themselves, but they don't seem to be taking it at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Nick, there's a couple of different questions there on different aspects of devolution, and then maybe on also the kind of Commission's point.
Yeah. So on Northern Ireland, I mean, the issue for Labour is just to hold together the Assembly, is to maintain progress on the Windsor framework and peace in Northern Ireland. Hilary Benn is exactly the right person to do that. It's why he's in the right job. The prospect of Sinn Féin administrations north and south has receded after the European elections in the south. The big challenge will be on public spending and public services in Northern Ireland, and on things like Harland and Wolff jobs, where there are real challenges. So that's, for me, the sort of response on Northern Ireland. On regional English devolution, I mean, the logic of devolution hitherto has been to devolve public spending and powers over public spending, and then later to follow with tax reform, incremental accretion of tax powers. That's what happened in Scotland and Wales. Didn't happen in London, actually. London has not been given more tax-raising powers. And so it's I think probably in this term, this Parliament, you'll see more devolution to the combined authorities with more spending of skills and all the rest of it. If they're going to be taxing tax powers given to combined authorities or to local authorities even, that will be in a second term, if at all, actually, because it's a very, very difficult process to achieve. And on royal commissions, and thank you, I am a member of the USS, so I'm interested that you're here. The Turner Commission was 3 people, not a royal commission. It was incredibly well focused, did a brilliant job over a number of years, and it was very political as well as being really good on the policy. It really thought hard about the deliverability, and the settlement it put in place has endured. I've written about this, so I'll send you my paper. It's really important.
It's the right person to ask. He could go on for hours about this. Paula, the question basically saying, it's all very difficult, it's going to be really hard to make a lot of progress. Isn't that kind of dry tinder for a Farage-led Reform Party? So,
it's hard to see an election better set up for Farage than this one. You know, the Conservatives will probably be a bit more popular by the time of the next election. I mean, it depends how long they spend tearing themselves apart and who they put in as leader. But they'll probably be a bit more popular. And I think we should look at how Reform did. And I think sorry, I keep saying when I've got data, but I think they should have done better, given the context of the election. I think there were more voters there that they could have won, who probably many of them stayed at home. And I think some of them went back to the Conservatives very late in the campaign for various reasons. So, yes, there might be lots of angry voters, but those angry voters are very much out of step with Reform on economic policy. They agree with them on immigration, but they don't want to see private enterprise in the NHS and tax breaks for public schools and all the other things that Reform were promising. And so that anger, I think, will be more likely to be, if it occurs, I'm not even sure it will. As I said, I think the electorate might be pleasantly surprised by a Labour government. But if it occurs, I think it's more likely to manifest in further disillusionment and disengagement from the political process than Reform being able to capitalise on it.
Thank you. Heather, last word to you.
Well, just to say on Reform, there's also a non-trivial risk that rather than enhancing their reputation, having to turn up in Parliament or not turn up in Parliament, actually, you know, they've just appointed Lee Anderson as Chief Whip. He would start a fight in an empty room. I mean, there's a non-trivial risk that it doesn't enhance, that 5 years of having to turn up in Parliament doesn't enhance their reputation. In fact, you know, it reduces it, but we will see.
Right. We're just over time, so that is your lot. Thank you so much first of all, to all of you in the room for coming along. It's great to have a really good live audience, and they were great questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us online. I hope we sorted the sound out. Apologies if it didn't start off as well as it could have done. And last but not least, thanks to our brilliant panel. I thought they were great speakers, each and every one. Thank you.